She gave him her youth, her savings, and her absolute devotion. He repaid her by tossing her aside for a billionaire's daughter, leaving her with nothing but a packed suitcase and a shattered heart. For 5 years, she was a ghost. Now he's on the verge of the biggest deal of his life, but the ruthless investor holding the kill switch isn't a stranger. It's the wife he threw away. Poverty is rarely a sudden crash. It is usually a slow, grinding erosion of the soul. For Madeleine and Damien Hayes, it was the damp walls of a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Rainier Valley, Seattle. It was the sound of the radiator clanking in the dead of winter, and the precise, terrifying mathematics of stretching $20 over 4 days of groceries. Madeleine didn't mind the struggle. She was 24, deeply in love, and believed with absolute certainty that she and Damien were building an empire from the dirt up. She worked double shifts at a local diner, coming home with her clothes smelling of stale grease and cheap coffee, just so Damien could finish his MBA without the burden of student loans. She typed his thesis on a second-hand laptop while he slept. She skipped her own dental appointments to afford his tailored interview suit. She was his foundation. And for a time, Damien played the part of the grateful partner. He was intensely ambitious, possessing a shark-like charisma that made people want to agree with him. "Just wait, Maddie," he would whisper in the dark, holding her calloused hands. "One day we'll be at the top of the glass towers. I'll buy you the world." The turning point came when Damien landed a junior executive position at Kensington Global, a titan in commercial real estate development. The shift in him wasn't overnight, but it was absolute. It started with the cologne he abandoned his drugstore brand for something sharp and expensive that he claimed was a gift from a vendor. Then came the late nights, the urgent client dinners, and the sudden irrational irritation whenever Madeleine asked about his day. Madeleine, blinded by her inherent trust, assumed the corporate world was simply taking its toll. She didn't notice how he had stopped looking at her when they spoke. She didn't notice that her presence had become an embarrassment to him. The illusion shattered on a rainy Tuesday in November. Damien had left his iPad on the kitchen counter, synced to his phone. Madeleine was wiping down the laminate surfaces when the screen lit up with a message notification. She didn't mean to snoop. The preview text was simply too large to ignore. "Charlie K., tell me you're not bringing the charity case to the Aspen retreat. My father wants to introduce you to the board. You need to cut the dead weight, D. Damien, I'm handling it. She's clueless. Aspen is just you and me. Love you." The words didn't compute at first. Madeleine stood in the dim kitchen, the dish towel slipping from her hands. Her heart didn't break. It simply stopped freezing the blood in her veins. "Charlie K., Charlie Kensington, the daughter of Harrison Kensington, the CEO of the company. A lesser woman might have screamed." Madeleine waited. She waited 3 days, tracking the subtle clues, the hushed phone calls, the bank statements Damien thought he had hidden. She found the lease for a luxury townhouse in Bellevue, signed under his name, paid for by an account she didn't recognize. When she finally confronted him, it wasn't in their miserable apartment. She took the bus across the bridge, walking through the manicured lawns of Bellevue, and let herself into the townhouse, using a spare key she'd found in his coat pocket. She sat in the dark on an imported Italian leather sofa, waiting. At 8 p.m., the door unlocked. Damien walked in, laughing, his arm wrapped around a striking, immaculately dressed blonde woman. Charlie. When Damien saw Madeleine sitting there, the laughter died in his throat. But what struck Madeleine wasn't his guilt. It was the complete absence of it. "Maddie," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he used to reserve for her. "What are you doing here?" "You left your iPad unlocked," she replied, her voice trembling, despite her desperate attempt to keep it steady. She looked at Charlie, who was staring at her with a mixture of amusement and profound boredom. "Oh," Charlie drawled, leaning against the doorframe, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the hallway light. "So this is the infamous starter wife. Damien, you didn't tell me she looked so exhausted." Madeline stood up, ignoring the other woman, her eyes locked on the man she had bled for. 5 years, Damien. I paid your tuition. I fed you when we had nothing. And you're doing this." Damien sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as if dealing with a mildly annoying customer. "Let's not do the hysterics, Madeline. You were a great partner when I was starting out. But look at where I am now, and look at you. I'm entering a world you don't understand and can't survive in. You were a stepping stone. But I need a rocket ship. Charlie is my future." He pulled a checkbook from his breast pocket, scribbling a number on it. He tore it out and dropped it on the glass coffee table. "There's $20,000. It covers what you spent on my tuition. Go back to the diner, Maddie. Find someone in your own league." Charlie smirked. "Be a good girl and close the door on your way out." Something inside Madeline didn't just break. It hardened into absolute impenetrable diamond. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She looked at the check, then at Damien, memorizing the arrogant tilt of his chin and the coldness in his eyes. She didn't take the check. She simply walked past them out into the pouring Seattle rain. When Damien returned to their apartment the next day to formally pack up his things, he found it completely empty. Madeline's clothes were gone. Her sparse belongings were gone. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the scent of cheap cleaning supplies and the echo of a locked door. 5 years later, Damien Hayes had everything he had ever told himself he wanted. He was the chief operating officer of Kensington Global. He wore bespoke suits imported from Milan, drove a slate-grey Aston Martin, and lived in a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate on Mercer Island. He was married to Charlie, and society magazines frequently featured them as Seattle's premier power couple. To the outside world, Damien was a king. Inside the walls of his marriage and his company, he was a well-dressed prisoner. The reality of marrying into the Kensington Empire was a bitter pill that Damien was forced to swallow daily. Harrison Kensington, his father-in-law, viewed Damien not as an equal, but as a useful, aggressively ambitious dog. And Charlie, once the glittering prize, had revealed herself to be fiercely controlling, weaponizing her wealth at every turn. "Don't forget whose name is on the building, Damien," she would remind him during their frequent icy arguments over dinner. "You're only here because I allowed it." Damien's pride, a monstrous and fragile thing, could not handle the subjugation. He needed a way out from under the Kensington thumb, a victory so absolute that neither his wife nor her father could ever question his supremacy again. He found it in Project Apex. It was a colossal undertaking, a $2 billion revitalization of Seattle's forgotten waterfront district. If Kensington Global secured the rights and built the proposed tech hub retail spaces and luxury high-rises, Damien, who was spearheading the project, would become untouchable. The board would have to name him the successor over Harrison's own nephews. But empire building is a dangerous game. To secure the initial permits and muscle out competitors, Damien had taken immense risks. Unbeknownst to Harrison, Damien had leveraged a massive amount of Kensington Global's liquid assets alongside his own personal equity through shadow LLCs. It was highly illegal, a massive breach of fiduciary duty. If the project succeeded, the missing funds would be replaced before the quarterly audit, and no one would be the wiser. If it failed, Damien wouldn't just lose his job, he would face federal prison. Everything was going perfectly, until a wrench was thrown into the gears by an entity known as Valiant Capital. Valiant Capital was a ruthless, notoriously secretive private equity firm based out of New York. Over the course of 3 months, Valiant had quietly bought up the mezzanine debt of Project Apex's primary contractors and acquired the last 3 crucial parcels of waterfront land that Kensington Global desperately needed to break ground. Valiant was strangling Project Apex, and by extension, Damien. "Who the hell is running this firm?" Damien barked, pacing the length of his expansive glass-walled office. He hurled a heavy crystal tumbler against the wall, shattering it. His assistant, trembling, looked down at her tablet. "They're a private syndicate, sir. The CEO operates under absolute anonymity. The industry just calls them the Architect. They've rejected our last 4 buyout offers. They don't want our money, Mr. Hayes. They've called a meeting for tomorrow at 10 a.m. "Where?" Damien demanded. "Here, in our boardroom. The Architect is flying in personally." That night, Damien barely slept. He lay awake in his sprawling master bedroom, listening to the steady breathing of Charlie beside him. She didn't know about the leveraged assets. If the deal collapsed tomorrow, she would divorce him, strip him of his prenuptial allowances, and leave him with nothing but legal fees. The anxiety was a physical weight on his chest, a tightness he hadn't felt since his days freezing in that Rainier Valley apartment. Tomorrow, he told himself, staring at the vaulted ceiling. Tomorrow I charm this Architect. I offer them a seat on the board. Whatever it takes. The atmosphere in boardroom 402 was suffocating. Located on the top floor of the Kensington Tower, the room offered a panoramic view of the Puget Sound, but nobody was looking at the water. Damien stood at the head of the long mahogany table, checking his Rolex for the 5th time. Beside him sat Charlie, looking impeccably bored in a white Chanel suit, tapping a manicured fingernail against her coffee cup. At the far end of the table sat Harrison Kensington himself, a man whose resting expression was one of deep disappointment. "This is embarrassing, Damien," Harrison rumbled, checking his own watch. It was 10:05 a.m. "You assured me this Apex land acquisition was handled. Now we have some anonymous vulture capitalist holding a gun to our heads in our own building." "It's a negotiation tactic, Harrison," Damien said smoothly, projecting a confidence he absolutely didn't feel. "Valiant Capital wants to flex their muscles. Let them. We have the capital to absorb them or partner with them. I will handle it." "You better," Charlie muttered softly, not looking at him. "Or Daddy might finally realize you're just a glorified secretary." Damien gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the back of his leather chair. At exactly 10:07 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. The room fell dead silent. The clicking of sharp stilettos echoed against the marble floor. A phalanx of 3 severe-looking corporate lawyers entered first, carrying sleek leather briefcases. They parted silently, stepping to the side to make way for the CEO of Valiant Capital. Damien put on his most charming, predatory smile and stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome to Kensington Global. I'm Damien Hayes, COO. And this is—" His voice died. The word simply evaporated from his throat, as if sucked into a vacuum. His extended hand dropped slowly to his side. The woman standing before him took off her dark Tom Ford sunglasses, folding them with deliberate, agonizing slowness. She was unrecognizable, yet the face was burned into Damien's nightmares. The tired, mousy girl with the frizzy hair and the smell of diner grease was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in absolute fire. She wore a tailored midnight blue Alexander McQueen suit that draped perfectly over her frame. Her hair was a sleek, devastatingly sharp bob. Her posture radiated a cold, terrifying authority that immediately dwarfed every man in the room. but it was her eyes that stopped Damien's heart. They were the eyes of a sniper looking through a scope. "Hello, Damien," Madeleine Foster said. Her voice was smooth, rich, and utterly devoid of warmth. "It's been a while." Charlie frowned, leaning forward in her chair, squinting. It took her brain a few seconds to connect the glamorous titan in the doorway to the broken, soaking, wet girl she had mocked 5 years ago. When the realization hit, Charlie's jaw dropped. You're... The charity case," Madeleine finished for her, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She walked past a paralyzed Damien and took the seat directly across from Harrison Kensington. Her lawyers moved seamlessly, opening their briefcases and distributing thick, terrifyingly detailed dossiers to everyone at the table. "Mr. Kensington," Madeleine said, nodding to the older man who looked utterly bewildered by the dynamics in the room. "I am Madeleine Foster, CEO and primary shareholder of Valiant Capital." "You're the architect?" Harrison asked, leaning forward, intrigued by the sheer dominance she commanded. "I must admit, Foster, you've played a brutal game in the market. You have my company in a very precarious position regarding Project Apex." "I have your company by the throat, Mr. Kensington," Madeleine corrected him politely, as if discussing the weather. "Valiant Capital owns 80% of the land you need. We also bought the debt of your steel suppliers, your concrete vendors, and your primary logistics firm. Without my signature, Project Apex doesn't just stall, it dies." Damien finally found his voice. He felt dizzy, the ground tilting beneath him. Madeleine, what is this? What are you doing here?" Madeleine finally turned her gaze to him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "This is a business meeting, Mr. Hayes. We are here to discuss a merger, or more accurately, a surrender." She opened the file in front of her. "Over the past 48 hours, my forensic accountants have been reviewing the financial structures of Project Apex, specifically the shadow LLCs, routing money from Kensington Global's pension funds to cover your initial permit bribes, Damien." Charlie snapped her head toward her husband. "What is she talking about, Damien pension funds?" Harrison's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "Hayes, tell me she's lying." Damien was sweating through his bespoke suit. He looked at Madeleine, his eyes pleading. "Maddie, please. We can talk about this privately. Just you and me. Let's not do this here." "But we must do it here, Damien," Madeleine whispered, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. "Because 5 years ago, you told me I couldn't survive in this world. You told me I was a stepping stone. So I took your advice. I found someone in my own league." She tapped a manicured finger against the damning financial report. "Myself." She leaned back, interlacing her fingers. "I don't just want Project Apex, gentlemen. I want Kensington Global. And by the time we leave this room, you are going to give it to me." The silence that followed Madeleine's ultimatum was heavy enough to crack the marble floor. Boardroom 402, usually a sanctuary of Kensington Global's corporate invincibility, had transformed into an execution chamber. Harrison Kensington didn't look at Damien. He didn't scream or throw a tantrum. Instead, with the slow, deliberate movements of an apex predator assessing a fatal wound, the older man opened the thick manila folder Madeleine's lawyers had placed before him. The sound of pages turning echoed like gunshots. Damien's breath hitched in his throat. He watched the color drain from his father-in-law's face. The dossier was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It detailed every shadow LLC registered in Delaware under Damien's aliases. It showed the exact IP addresses used to authorize the transfer of $68 million from the Kensington Employee Pension Fund to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It even included time-stamped photographs of Damien meeting with corrupt city zoning officials at the Columbia Tower Club, handing over envelopes of cash to expedite the waterfront permits for Project Apex. It was airtight. It was utter annihilation. Harrison. Damien started his voice a pathetic, reedy scrape. Harrison, I can explain the liquidity movements. It was a temporary bridge loan. I was going to replace the capital before the Q3 audit. The waterfront returns would have tripled the pension. Shut up, Harrison said. His voice was a terrifying whisper. He closed the folder, pressing his wrinkled hands flat against the mahogany table. He finally looked at Damien, and the sheer, unadulterated hatred in the older man's eyes made Damien physically recoil. You stole from my employees. You leveraged my family's name to commit federal wire fraud. You arrogant, stupid, worthless little parasite. Charlie, sensing the seismic shift in power, acted with the ruthless self-preservation she had been bred for. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and distanced herself from Damien. "Daddy," Charlie said, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes sharp and calculating. "I knew nothing about this. He managed his own portfolios. I swear to you, I had no idea he was embezzling." Damien stared at his wife, betrayed. "Charlie, we spent that money together. The yacht in Monaco. The renovations on the Mercer Island estate. You signed off on the wire transfers. I signed documents my husband told me pertained to his legitimate bonuses." Charlie shrieked, playing the victim with Oscar-worthy precision. She turned to the room, her Chanel suit suddenly feeling like armor she needed to polish. "He lied to me, just like he lied to her." She gestured vaguely toward Madeline, refusing to even use her name. Madeline watched the implosion of the Hayes-Kensington marriage with the detached fascination of a scientist observing microbes in a petri dish. She did not smile. She simply steepled her fingers, her Alexander McQueen suit immaculate, her posture relaxed. "The domestic disputes are entirely irrelevant to Valiant Capital." Madeline interrupted, her voice slicing through the shouting match. "Here are the terms of your surrender, Mr. Kensington. Valiant will absorb the $68 million deficit in your pension fund, saving you from a devastating SEC investigation and the immediate collapse of your stock price. In exchange, Valiant Capital takes a 51% controlling stake in Kensington Global. We also take full ownership of Project Apex." Harrison's jaw clenched. 51%. You want my company? My father built this firm, and your son-in-law destroyed it." Madeline counted, her eyes flat and unforgiving. "You have 24 hours to sign the merger documents. If my lawyers do not have your signature by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will forward this dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI field office in Seattle, and the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Kensington Global will be delisted from the NYSE by Friday, and you will spend the rest of your life buried in class action lawsuits." Harrison looked at the files, then at his daughter, and finally at the man who had brought this plague into his house. "You're fired, Damien," Harrison said, his voice hollow. "Security will escort you out. If you ever contact me or my daughter again, I won't need lawyers to ruin you." Damien felt the blood rushing to his ears. The world tilted. "You can't do this. I built Apex. It was my vision." He turned to Madeline, his composure completely fracturing. "Maddie, please. You won. You proved your point. Take the project. Take the money. But don't do this to me. I'm your husband. Ex-husband," Madeline corrected smoothly. "And I haven't even started, Damien." She stood up, buttoning her suit jacket with elegant precision. 5 years ago, you told me I was a stepping stone. You told me to go back to the diner. You were right about one thing, Damien. I didn't understand your world." She walked slowly around the table, stopping just inches from him. Damien could smell her perfume, something expensive, complex, and intoxicating, carrying notes of sandalwood and cold smoke. "So I learned," she whispered, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "When you left me with nothing, I took a Greyhound bus to New York. I slept on the floor of a studio apartment in Queens. I got an entry-level analyst job at a brutal hedge fund on Broad Street, working 90-hour weeks for a man who made Harrison Kensington look like a saint. I learned how to read distressed debt. I learned how to find the weak links in corporate armor. And for 5 years, Damien, I studied you. I tracked every bad investment, every arrogant risk, every illegal shortcut you took." She stepped back, her eyes devoid of any pity. "I didn't just come back to beat you. I came back to erase you." 10 minutes later, Damien found himself standing on the rain-slicked pavement of Fifth Avenue, physically shoved out the glass doors by 2 burly Kensington security guards. His security badge was deactivated. His company phone was wiped remotely. Panicking, he pulled out his personal phone and opened his banking app. A red banner flashed across the screen, "Account frozen. Pending legal review." Harrison's lawyers moved with terrifying speed. Desperate, he hailed a cab, paying with the last $40 of cash in his custom leather wallet, and rushed back to Mercer Island. He needed his passport, his emergency cash reserves, hidden in his home office, his expensive watches. He could flee to Geneva. He had contacts there. But when the cab pulled up to the sprawling gated estate, Damien found the iron gates locked. Sitting on the wet driveway just outside the perimeter were 3 black garbage bags. A security guard he had personally hired stood on the other side of the gate, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry, Mr. Hayes. Mrs. Hayes's orders. She said to tell you the locks are changed, and her divorce attorneys will contact you. She also said, she said to tell you that you should go find someone in your own league." Damien stood in the freezing Seattle drizzle, staring at the garbage bags containing his designer clothes. The echo of the words he had spoken to Madeline 5 years ago rang in his ears, deafening and absolute. He had nothing. 3 weeks, that was all it took for Damien Hayes to fall from the apex of Seattle's high society to the absolute bottom of the food chain. He was currently living in room 114 of the Ironwood Motel, a dilapidated establishment near the SeaTac airport, where the carpets smelled perpetually of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. His bespoke Milan suits were hanging limply on a cheap metal rack, wrinkled and useless. He spent his days drinking cheap bourbon from a plastic cup and frantically working on a battered second-hand laptop he had bought from a pawn shop. The corporate massacre had been total. Harrison Kensington had signed the surrender documents. Valiant Capital had swallowed Kensington Global whole, absorbing its assets and restructuring its board. Madeline Foster was now the undisputed queen of the Pacific Northwest real estate and private equity markets. As for Damien, he was a pariah. Every former friend, every golfing buddy, every political contact he had cultivated over the last 5 years refused his calls. Gregory Pierce, a managing partner at Pierce & Company, whom Damien had practically made a millionaire through insider tips, had his secretary hang up on Damien 3 times. When Damien showed up at Gregory's office, security threatened to call the police. Madeline had quietly blacklisted him across the entire financial sector. To associate with Damien Hayes was to invite the wrath of the architect. But Damien was a survivor, driven by a toxic, festering pride. He refused to believe a diner waitress had outsmarted him flawlessly. There had to be a crack in her armor. For 3 weeks, he barely slept, scouring public financial records, digging into Valiant Capital's SEC filings, and tracing offshore shell companies. He was looking for the same kind of illegal leverage he had used. Valiant Capital had seemingly appeared out of nowhere to buy $1 billion worth of debt and land. Where did the seed money come from? Damien reasoned. No hedge fund gives a nobody that kind of blank check. She had to have committed fraud to build her war chest. At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, staring red-eyed at a spreadsheet, Damien found something. An anomaly. Before Valiant Capital officially incorporated, there was a massive influx of capital, over $400 million, funneled through a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic money laundering footprint. If Damien could prove Madeleine's initial capital was dirty, he could blow the whistle. He could take his findings to Thomas Miller, the notoriously aggressive investigative journalist at Bloomberg, and trigger an SEC raid on Valiant Capital. He would destroy her empire just as she destroyed his. He needed a public venue to confront her, to force a reaction that Thomas Miller could witness. He knew exactly where she would be. That Friday night, the Fairmont Olympic Hotel was hosting the annual Pacific Northwest Philanthropy Gala. It was the most exclusive event of the year, a gathering of billionaires, politicians, and tech titans. Madeleine Foster, as the new owner of Kensington Global and the savior of Project Apex, was the guest of honor. Getting in was difficult, but Damien still had a few tricks. He bribed a catering staff member, using the very last of the cash he had pawned his Rolex for, to secure a server's uniform. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont was a breathtaking display of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables draped in silk. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters glided through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and caviar. Damien, wearing a slightly ill-fitting white jacket, kept his head down, navigating the edges of the room. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the crowd until he saw her. Madeleine stood near the center of the room, holding court. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald green gown that caught the light with every movement. A diamond necklace rested against her collarbone. She looked completely at home, radiating power, laughing softly at a joke made by the mayor of Seattle. Damien felt a surge of pure, venomous rage. He gripped the flash drive in his pocket, the drive containing the data on the Cayman Island Blind Trust. He saw Thomas Miller, the Bloomberg journalist, standing near the ice sculpture, nursing a scotch. It's time, Damien thought. He abandoned his serving tray on a side table and marched directly toward the center of the room. He didn't care about the gasps from the guests as a waiter aggressively pushed past billionaires. He didn't care about the security guards who suddenly realized something was wrong and started moving in. Madeleine! Damien's voice ripped through the elegant hum of the gala, harsh and desperate. The music faltered. The room went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to look at the disheveled man in the waiter's jacket, standing 10 feet away from the guest of honor. Madeleine turned slowly. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look surprised or frightened. She looked at him the way one looks at a stray dog that had wandered onto a pristine lawn. "Damien," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I see you found employment more suited to your actual skill set." A few scattered cruel laughs rippled through the crowd. Damien flushed crimson, his fists clenching. "Laugh all you want, Maddie," he sneered, stepping closer, holding up the silver flash drive. "I know how you did it. I know about the $400 million in the Cayman Blind Trust. I know you didn't earn that money legally. You committed wire fraud to get the seed money for Valiant Capital. You're dirtier than I ever was." He pointed at the journalist. "Thomas Miller is right there. I have the data, Madeleine. The SEC is going to tear you apart. You're going to prison." The security guards finally reached him, grabbing his arms roughly, but Madeleine raised a single elegant, manicured hand. "Stop," she commanded. The guards froze instantly. Madeleine took a sip of her champagne, her green eyes locking onto Damien's frantic, sweat-beaded face. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. "You found the Cayman Trust?" Madeline said softly, almost sounding impressed. "You really have been busy in that roach-infested motel, haven't you, Damien? You spent 3 weeks digging into my history, desperate to find the monster you think I am." "I found the truth," he yelled, struggling slightly against the guard's grip. "No, Damien," she said, taking a slow, predatory step toward him. "You found half the truth, because your arrogance never allows you to see the full picture." She signaled to one of her aides standing nearby. The man handed her a sleek iPad. Madeline tapped the screen a few times and then turned it around so Damien and the surrounding guests could see. It was a financial ledger. "You see, Damien," Madeline explained, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet ballroom. "When you left me, you thought I was stupid. You thought because I worked in a diner, I didn't understand the documents I typed up for your MBA. You forgot that I read every single thesis you wrote. I knew your exact philosophy on market manipulation. I knew exactly which sectors you believed were overvalued and which corrupt tech startups you were secretly advising on the side." Damien stopped struggling. A cold dread began to pool in his stomach. "When I got to New York," Madeline continued, "I found a billionaire named Jonathan Croft, an eccentric man who loved a good gamble. I went to him with a portfolio mapping out every illegal, highly leveraged investment you and your associates at Kensington Global were quietly backing. I told him that within 4 years the house of cards you built would collapse. He gave me a job and he let me short the market based on my intimate knowledge of your massive ego." She stepped closer until she was mere inches from his face, her emerald gown brushing against his cheap white uniform. "That 400 million in the Cayman Trust, Damien. It isn't dirty money. It's the profit I made from betting against you. Every time you cut a corner, every time you took a bribe, every time you over-leveraged a shell company, my fund was shorting your position. I didn't steal that money. You handed it to me. I got rich by monetizing your sheer, breathtaking incompetence." The revelation hit Damien like a physical blow. His legs gave out, and if the security guards hadn't been holding him, he would have collapsed to the floor. She hadn't cheated. She had simply known him perfectly, and she had used his own corrupt ambition to fund his destruction. "And as for your leverage," Madeline leaned in her voice, dropping to a harsh whisper, meant only for him. "Look behind you." Damien slowly turned his head. Standing near the edge of the crowd, wearing a dress from last season and looking desperate, was Charlie. She wasn't glaring at Madeline anymore. She was looking at Madeline with absolute submission. Charlie's trust fund was tied up in Kensington stock, Madeline whispered, twisting the knife. "When I took over, the stock dipped, triggering her margin calls. She has nothing left, Damien. In fact, she came to my office yesterday, begging for a junior PR position just to keep her country club membership. I hired her. She fetches my coffee now." Damien stared at his ex-wife, his mind completely broken. The flash drive slipped from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly onto the polished marble floor. He had nothing. No money, no wife, no reputation, and no revenge. He was entirely, fundamentally beaten. Madeline stepped back, the cold mask of the architect firmly in place. She looked at the security guards. "Take the trash out," she ordered, her voice devoid of any emotion. "It's starting to smell." The guards dragged Damien backward through the crowd. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just stared blankly at the brilliant, terrifying woman in the emerald dress as she turned away, picked up her champagne glass, and resumed her conversation with the mayor of Seattle, leaving him to vanish into the dark, rainy night. A ghost finally returning to the shadows where he belonged. The morning after the Fairmont Olympic Gala, Damien Hayes woke up with the taste of copper and stale whiskey in his mouth. He was lying face down on the threadbare carpet of room 114 at the Ironwood Motel. The pounding in his skull was a relentless drumbeat, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of reality settling over his chest. He had played his final card, and Madeline had not just beaten him. She had shown him that he was holding a hand she had dealt him in the first place. By noon, the final blow landed. A heavy fist pounded on his motel door. It was Brenda, the chain-smoking manager of the Ironwood, accompanied by a local sheriff's deputy. Damien's credit cards, which had been clinging to their final margins, had all been officially frozen by court order, pending the sprawling investigation Thomas Miller's Bloomberg article had triggered that very morning. "Time's up, Hayes." Brenda barked a cigarette dangling from her lower lip. "Card declined. You've got 10 minutes to pack your trash." Damien didn't argue. The fight had been entirely bled out of him. He gathered his few remaining possessions into a cheap canvas duffel bag. He walked out into the relentless slate-grey Seattle drizzle, the damp chill biting through his thin jacket. He had no car. The Aston Martin had been repossessed weeks ago. He had $42 in his pocket, a dead cell phone, and a name that was now synonymous with corporate fraud and catastrophic failure. Across the water in the heart of downtown Seattle, Madeline Foster was systematically erasing the Kensington legacy from the skyline. Boardroom 402, the site of Damien's execution, was currently undergoing a massive renovation. Madeline despised the heavy, oppressive mahogany and the old money arrogance of the decor. She had ordered the room gutted. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the ferries carve white paths across the dark waters of Puget Sound. She was dressed in a sharp, dove-grey Celine suit, sipping a cup of black coffee. The heavy double doors opened, and her new junior PR assistant hurried in carrying a stack of press releases. "Ms. Foster," Charlie said, her voice breathier stripped of its former aristocratic drawl. She wore a modest, off-the-rack navy dress. The diamonds were gone. The arrogance was gone. In its place was the panicked obedience of a woman who had realized exactly how fragile her existence was. Madeline didn't turn around immediately. She let the silence stretch, forcing Charlie to stand perfectly still, waiting for permission to speak further. It was a power play, small but absolute, and they both knew it. "Put them on the glass table, Charlie," Madeline finally instructed, keeping her gaze on the water. "Yes, Miss Foster." Charlie quickly set the folders down. She hesitated, nervously smoothing her skirt. I also spoke with the caterers for the Project Apex rebranding gala next month. They've agreed to the updated menu." "It's not Project Apex anymore," Madeline corrected her softly, turning to face the blonde woman who had once mocked her in a Bellevue townhouse. "It is the Valiant Waterfront Initiative. See to it that anyone in the press department who uses the old name is terminated." "Of course. Valiant Waterfront Initiative. I'll make sure of it." Charlie swallowed hard. Is there anything else you need? Coffee." Madeline looked at Charlie, studying the dark circles under the former heiress's eyes. Charlie was living in a rented condo in Queen Anne, surviving on a junior assistant's salary, terrified that a single mistake would cost her the job and plunge her into the same abyss Damien currently inhabited. "No, Charlie. That will be all." As Charlie practically fled the room, Madeline felt a hollow calmness. There was no joy in breaking Charlie. It was simply the balancing of a ledger. For Damien, however, the ledger was far from settled. A week later, desperation drove Damien to the only place he thought might offer him a lifeline. He took 2 buses to reach the suburban headquarters of Pacific Heritage Bank in Renton. The bank manager, A man named Mitchell Davis used to play golf with Damien at the Broadmoor Golf Club. Damien had once tipped Mitchell off to a lucrative zoning change, netting the banker a quiet six-figure windfall. Damien walked into the lobby, shivering, his clothes unwashed. He approached the receptionist and demanded to see Mitchell. After 20 agonizing minutes, Mitchell emerged from his glass-walled office. He didn't invite Damien in. He stood in the lobby, his expression a mixture of pity and intense discomfort. "Damien, what are you doing here?" Mitchell whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Mitch, I need a loan. A personal loan off the books." Damien pleaded, his pride utterly shattered. He gripped Mitchell's sleeve. "Just 10 grand, 5 grand. I just need to get out of Seattle. I can go to Chicago, start over. I'll pay you back with 20% interest once I get on my feet." Mitchell gently but firmly pried Damien's fingers off his suit jacket. "Damien, I can't. You're radioactive. The SEC is crawling all over your old accounts, and Thomas Miller is publishing a follow-up piece on your associates tomorrow. If anyone sees me giving you a dime, I'm an accessory to wire fraud." "I made you rich," Damien hissed, his voice cracking. "That zoning tip in Bellevue. You owe me." Mitchell's eyes hardened. "I don't owe you anything. You played a crooked game and you lost. Do not ever come to this bank again, Damien, or I will have security arrest you for trespassing." Mitchell turned and walked back into his office, closing the blinds. Damien stumbled out of the bank and into the cold parking lot. The realization crashed down on him with the weight of an anvil. There was no comeback. There was no secret contact who would save him. He had spent his entire career treating people as stepping stones, and now that he was at the bottom, there was no one left to step on. As the winter weeks bled into months, Damien's descent accelerated. He spent his nights sleeping in the back of a rusted 1998 Honda Civic he had bought from a scrapyard with the last of his pawn shop money. He parked under the elevated highways near the industrial district, shivering under a single moth-eaten blanket. He survived by working cash-in-hand day labor jobs, hauling concrete, clearing construction debris, sweeping warehouses. The irony was suffocating. He, the man who had designed the $2 billion waterfront revitalization, was now breaking his back for minimum wage, his hands blistered and cracked, his bespoke suits replaced by stained denim and a high-visibility orange safety vest. And everywhere he looked, Madeline was there. Her face was on the cover of Forbes, sitting neatly on the magazine racks of the convenience stores, where Damien bought his stale bread. Her voice emanated from the radios on construction sites, giving calm, authoritative interviews about the future of Seattle's economy. She was the ghost that haunted every waking second of his miserable existence. One evening in late April, Damien, exhausted and covered in drywall dust, parked his rusted Civic near a strip mall in Bellevue. He was walking toward a cheap diner when he saw her. Charlie. She was walking out of a grocery store carrying a single reusable bag. She looked tired, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy clip, wearing a simple trench coat. Damien's chest tightened. He hadn't seen her since the night of the gala. A desperate, irrational thought seized him. Maybe they could pool their misery. Maybe they could comfort each other, united in their hatred for Madeline. "Charlie," he called out, jogging across the wet asphalt. She stopped, turning toward the voice. When she recognized him beneath the grime and the overgrown beard, she didn't look angry. She looked terrified. She took a step back, clutching her groceries to her chest like a shield. "Charlie, wait. Please." Damien panted, holding up his calloused hands. "It's me. I know things have been bad. For both of us. But we're still legally married. We can figure something out. We can fight her together. Charlie stared at him, her eyes wide. "Are you insane?" she whispered harshly, glancing around the parking lot, as if expecting Madeline's snipers to be on the rooftops. "Stay away from me, Damien. She took everything from us. Your father's company, my career. She took what you stole." Charlie snapped her fear, suddenly turning into venomous anger. "You ruined me, Damien. You embezzled from my father. You used my name on those shell companies. Ms. Foster. Ms. Foster is the only reason I'm not in federal prison right now. She gave me a job. She lets me pay my rent." Damien stared at her horrified. "You call her Ms. Foster. She broke you, Charlie. She has you fetching her coffee. She gave me a chance to survive." Charlie yelled, tears pooling in her eyes. "Which is more than you ever did. You used me, just like you used her. The only difference is Madeline Foster is a god and you are a rat." Charlie backed away quickly, fumbling for her car keys. "Don't ever talk to me again. If you come near me, I will call the police." She got into a modest 5-year-old sedan, locked the doors, and Porters drove away, leaving Damien standing alone in the parking lot. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stood there as the Seattle rain began to fall again, washing the dust from his face. The absolute isolation was complete. Madeline hadn't just destroyed his wealth. She had dismantled his reality piece by piece until nothing was left but the hollow shell of a man who had flown too close to the sun. 14 months had passed since the boardroom massacre. It was a crisp, brilliantly clear evening in late November, precisely 6 years to the day since Damien had handed Madeline a check for $20,000 and told her to disappear. Tonight was the grand opening of the Valiant Waterfront Initiative. The Seattle waterfront had been entirely transformed. Where there were once rotting piers and abandoned warehouses, there now stood a glittering architectural masterpiece. 3 towering structures of glass and steel twisted toward the sky, connected by elevated sky bridges. Luxury retail spaces, public parks, and a massive technology incubator formed a pristine ecosystem of wealth and progress. It was exactly the vision Damien had pitched. It was his dream, his masterpiece, but his name was nowhere to be found. Instead, glowing in subtle, elegant silver letters on the side of the central tower, were the words, "The Foster Complex." The Grand Plaza was cordoned off with velvet ropes and swarming with private security. The mayor was there, the governor was there, and a sea of photographers flashed their cameras as Seattle's elite poured into the glass pavilion for the inaugural gala. 2 blocks away, just outside the perimeter of the police barricades, Damien Hayes was working. He wore a thick, neon yellow safety jacket over 3 layers of cheap sweatshirts. He held a long-handled trash grabber in one hand and dragged a heavy black garbage bin with the other. He was part of the municipal sanitation crew, contracted to keep the perimeter clean during the high-profile event. Damien's face was weathered, his skin prematurely aged from sleeping in his car and working in the elements. The fire in his eyes had long since been extinguished, replaced by the dull, vacant stare of a man who was merely waiting to die. He picked up a discarded champagne cork from the gutter, tossing it into the bin. He paused, leaning against the plastic rim, and looked up at the towering glass structures. The sky bridges were illuminated, filled with people in tuxedos and gowns, drinking expensive wine and celebrating the future. "I built that," a tiny, pathetic voice whispered in the back of his mind. That was mine. But the voice lacked conviction. He knew the truth now. He had drawn the blueprints, but he had built it on a foundation of theft, deceit, and arrogance. Madeline had built it on stone. Around 11:30 p.m., the gala began to wind down. The VIPs started leaving the pavilion, making their way to the fleet of black town cars, idling near the VIP exit on Alaskan Way. Damien was sweeping a section of the sidewalk near the exit, his head down, trying to remain invisible. He just wanted to finish his shift, get his $60 in cash, and buy a cheap bottle of vodka to numb the cold. "Bring the car around to the front, please. I'd prefer to walk the rest of the block," a voice said. Damien froze. The push broom stopped mid-sweep. The voice was smooth, rich, and carried an undeniable authority. He slowly lifted his head. Walking toward him, flanked by 2 towering private security guards, was Madeline. She wore a breathtaking floor-length midnight blue coat over her evening gown, a silk scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She looked like royalty. She looked untouchable. Damien couldn't move. He felt like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He prayed she would just walk past him. He prayed his thick beard and the neon jacket would disguise him in the dim streetlights. As she approached, her eyes casually scanned the sidewalk. They locked onto the sanitation worker, standing frozen by the garbage bin. Madeline stopped. The security guards immediately tensed their hands, hovering near their earpieces, but Madeline raised 2 fingers, silently ordering them to stand down. For 10 agonizing seconds, the billionaire architect of Seattle's future and the ruined ghost of its past simply looked at each other under the glow of a street lamp. Damien's chest heaved. He felt a sickening wave of shame wash over him. He wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. He looked down at his dirty, calloused hands, then back up at the woman he had thrown away like garbage. "Madeline," Damien croaked. His voice was a raspy whisper, ruined by cheap liquor and cold nights. Madeleine did not smile. She did not sneer. Her expression was one of profound, terrifying indifference. She looked at him the way one looks at a monument to a forgotten war, with a vague sense of historical acknowledgement, but absolutely no emotional connection. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, her voice soft, barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Damien's hands trembled on the handle of the broom. He looked up at the towering glass buildings, then back at her. "You took everything. My money, my wife, my name, even my buildings." He swallowed hard, a single pathetic tear tracking down his dirt-streaked cheek. "Are you happy now, Maddie? Did it fix whatever was broken in you?" Madeline tilted her head, slightly studying him. "You still don't understand, Damien," she said, her tone devoid of malice, which somehow made it infinitely worse. "This was never about happiness. Revenge is an emotional response. What I did to you was entirely mathematical." She took a slow step closer, her expensive perfume sandalwood and cold smoke cutting through the smell of the damp street and the garbage bin. "5 years ago you presented me with a ledger," she continued smoothly. "You assigned a value to my loyalty, my labor and my love, and you priced it at $20,000. You looked at me and calculated that I was a zero, that I was a liability. All I did, Damien, was audit your math." She gestured elegantly toward the towering glass structures behind her. "I didn't take your buildings. I foreclosed on your moral bankruptcy. You built a life on stolen money and betrayed trust. I just came to collect the debt." Damien stared at her, the words slicing through the final, rotting threads of his ego. He had always told himself she was a monster, a vindictive harpy who had destroyed him out of petty jealousy. But hearing her speak with such chilling clarity, he finally understood. She didn't hate him. He simply didn't matter to her anymore. He was a corrected error on a spreadsheet. "What am I supposed to do now?" Damien whispered, a pathetic plea for guidance from the woman who had conquered him. "I have nothing." Madeline looked at his battered boots, the cheap broom, and the neon vest. "You survived, Damien," she said softly. just like I did when you threw me out into the rain. You learn to live in the world you actually belong in." A sleek, black Maybach pulled up to the curb silently. One of the security guards opened the rear door. Madeline turned away from him, her midnight blue coat swirling beautifully in the cold wind. She didn't look back. She stepped into the warm, leather-scented interior of the car, and the door closed with a heavy, expensive thud. Damien stood perfectly still, his hands gripping the wooden handle of the push broom as the Maybach merged into traffic and disappeared into the glittering Seattle night. He was alone. The buildings towered above him, monuments to a woman's absolute triumph and a man's absolute ruin. The cold wind howled off the Puget Sound, biting through his cheap layers. With a slow mechanical movement, Damien Hayes lowered his head, turned around, and went back to sweeping the dust from Madeline Foster's streets. If this story of absolute betrayal, patience, and flawless revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, you are not alone. The transition from a shattered heart to an unstoppable force of nature proves that karma has a master plan. And sometimes the best revenge is simply massive, undeniable success. Do you think Damien got exactly what he deserved, or was Madeline's ledger too brutal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life drama and incredible twists.